The storm didn't arrive so much as decide the valley belonged to it. A fine, honest rain at dusk thickened to a bruised curtain by midnight. Then the wind turned, and the mountains let go of a season's worth of hoarded snow in a single, sickening exhale. Darren Miles woke to the sound of the river unlearning its banks, the low, impossible roar of water moving where water had no name. He was out of his cot before the sirens found their pitch, boots forgotten, toes numb on concrete as the first waves slapped the maintenance door like a debt collector. The reserve's lights strobed and failed, came back thin, died again. Beyond the tool bay, in the bowl of the valley, the nursery domes flickered like lanterns being argued with by wind. He ran, a wrench in one hand because habit misreads emergencies, a flare in the other because the night was using up light faster than the generators could make it. Mud climbed his shins, then his knees, then his thighs, each step a negotiation with suction as determined as grief. The outer hatch of the hatchling enclosure had jammed it on a drift of reeds and a plastic barrel that had no business being there. He shouldered it twice and felt something in his own body protest and then give. Inside, the air was a knifed mix of ozone and cold. Half the panels blown, the heater drowned to the control box, wires twitching like severed vines, and the sound was a dozen small throats trying to cry through water. A blue-scaled infant no heavier than a toolbox scrabbled at the grate, eyes wild with the kind of panic that climbs you from the inside. Darren slid on his knees, hooked his fingers under its ribs the way the medtech had shown him months ago, and lifted with the steady pressure that tells the body everything is still obeying the old rules. The little thing bit him, a reflex more apology than attack, then clamped its paws into his shirt as if fabric could be an answer. He set it on the only high ground he could see, an overturned feed crate, and found the next cry without looking, the way a mechanic finds a rattle by knowing which lies a machine likes to tell. The albino with the translucent membranes was stuck at the lip of a floor drain. One wing fed through the grate by the current. He flattened his palm along the slick deck, got his cheek against cold metal to see the angle, and eased the cartilage back out with 2 fingers and a word he hadn't used since he was a child. The flood found the door again, a push that knocked a rack of heat lamps off their mounts and sent glass humming across the floor. Darren kicked the shards into a safer shape, tore a tarp from a feed bin, and spread it across the rising water to buy himself a breathing space of inches. Somewhere upstream a gate failed like a snapped bone. The current in the dome shifted, lifting and dropping the crate of blues like a bad promise. He yanked the emergency float rings off the wall, clicked 2 together with the clumsy precision of a man whose hands are already bleeding, and tethered the makeshift raft to the leg of the central pen with a feed line. Good, he told no one in particular and the room in general, because sometimes you talk a space into remembering it works for you. A red hatchling with a torn crest shivered into his arms as if he had invented heat. He could feel the count forming behind his eyes. 1, 2, 3, and he let it grow, because numbers are the scaffolding you throw up when the building is still on fire. Outside, lightning stitched the ridge into brief, arrogant relief. Inside, he moved from cry to cry until motion turned into a single long decision. He was not going to leave this room with fewer lives than it held when he arrived. The river knocked a table against his hip hard enough to find an old bruise. He answered by stripping the table to its steel frame and jamming it crosswise in the hatch to slow the water a beat. The generator coughed. The lights humbled themselves to a dusk. He tore the flare cap with his teeth and planted the stick in a sand bucket, a pale orange warmth in a night that had decided everything should be blue. "I see you," he told the last 2, pressed flat against the far mesh, their pupils knives of fear. "You're not lost. You're here." His voice made it true long enough for his hands to catch up. When the dome shuddered, somewhere a strut grieved the math it had been promised. Darren looked up and saw the water licking at the level of the observation shelf. He felt the simple clarity of a job with no margins. He bent to the raft, counted again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and set his back to the door because the only way out was through. The first step into the flood took his breath like a bad joke told by a mean friend. The second took his balance. He let the current have his shins and insisted on his knees, leaning into it the way you lean into an engine that's trying to walk off its mounts. An old dance with new bruises. The dome door spat him into a world where landmarks had been demoted to debris. Fence posts slid by like sentences sawed in half. A bloody plank that used to be a bench kissed his thigh and buggered off downstream. The administrative shed, which had once bragged about its footings, floated past at a dignified angle like a bureaucrat refusing to admit to drowning. The rafts, 2 crates tied together, 4 hatchlings huddled on each, tails braided into one another by instinct older than engineering, bucked and spun behind him on their tether. He let the line pull him into the warm wake of a toppled aviary cage and used the eddy to steal 3 breaths he didn't own. A scream, high, thin, losing the argument with water, knifed in from his left. He found the source by feel, a little green wedged under an overturned feeding trough, the current pinning its chest to the silt and turning every inhale into a negotiation with darkness. He got his fingers under the trough's rim, lifted with the slow rage you save for unfair levers, and spoke breath into the tiny jaw when the lungs forgot their job. The green coughed, spat a rope of river, and made a surprised noise like gratitude discovering a mouth. Darren tucked it under his jacket until the tremor eased, then launched it hand to hand onto the nearer crate where 2 blues made space with solemn, enormous care. 7, he said, out loud because the river didn't get to own the only voice. Lightning found a fuel tank downstream and turned it into a false dawn that hurt to look at. The shockwave hit after, shouldered him under, made the world disappear into a roar that ate thoughts. He pinwheeled, groped for bottom, found none, kicked anyway because the body believes in air even when the brain does not. Something grabbed his hair and he reached to pry it loose, then realized he was being saved by a creature the size of a loaf of bread with claws like poor napkins. He surfaced with a heave that tore his ribs. The littlest albino rode his shoulder like a sailor who had already made an opinion of the sea and leaned into his ear with frantic hot breaths. 8, he rasped, and his voice sounded like someone else's in the weather. The current shoved the procession sideways toward the old stone outcrop the rangers called the Knuckle. In daylight, the Knuckle was a picnic bluff. At flood height, it was a choice. He grabbed the feed line with both hands and crabbed along it, angling the raft into the broken water behind a fallen tree. The makeshift flotilla slid into the lee with a sullen slap. The first crate thumped the rock and bounced. The second tried to climb the first. The tether screamed. He got his shoulder under the second crate and lifted enough to let it settle without eating the others. The little bodies inside did what frightened bodies do when shown a higher thing with a place to hold. Climbed, scrabbled, made a wall out of themselves. He pulled himself up the slope one rung at a time. Root, crack, miracle. Dragging the crates with a loop of rope around his hips, like a man hauling home a future no one had paid for. His bare feet found old lichen and new cuts. Grit fell away into blackness and didn't argue about it. At a shelf of stone 2 meters below the Knuckle's crown, he heaved the first crate into a cradle of scrub and barked a laugh that hurt because it left room for a sob. One by one, he lifted the hatchlings free and shoved them into the snug of rock and thorn that would scuff scales but not drown anything. 9 hearts pounded against his wrists, then 8, then 4, and the number that mattered did not go down. The last cry came late, a stubborn little sound that refused to admit to terror. He looked back and saw it, a bronze, older by a week, half submerged under the helix of a collapsed monitoring antenna. The coil had wrapped once around a foreleg and twice around a wing, the river trying to turn a body into a broken kite. Darren slid down the wet rock on his side and into the current that wanted him more than anyone had ever wanted him. The bronze went still when his hands found it, not trust exactly, more the exhausted relief of a creature whose last argument had been answered with something that felt like grammar. He levered the coil wide with his forearms, twisted his body between river and dragon, let the antenna grind a line of fire along his ribs and the wing slip free. When he shoved the bronze ahead of him, the river stole his feet and almost took the rest, but the little thing turned, jammed its head into his sternum, and together they crabbed into the lee like the ugliest 2-person boat ever tried. The knuckle gave him his knees back. He rolled the bronze up the shelf and let his arms be a floor. Above, a cluster of small shapes wriggled and made a sound like a prayer eaten by a purr. He counted because counting is how you betray panic to itself. 9, 10. The numbers arrived ragged and perfect. He laughed again, a noise so cracked it probably offended the storm. The river threw a final branch at the rock as if insulted by arithmetic. He ignored it. He hauled himself up the last meter with a groan that made the stone consider feeling sorry for him, and didn't. On the flat, he built a wall by accident. Misfit things wedged between bigger misfit things until the wind decided to go around instead of through. He snapped the plasma torch to life and fed it scraps of polymer from a broken panel until it threw off something like warmth. He stripped his jacket and set the albino under it, belly to his belly, counting the whistles until the torn flute learned a simpler psalm. He tucked the blues along his sides, the green under his arm, the bronze across his thighs like a blunt sword, and let the reds stack along his shins where blood was already finding its way out and down. He spoke nonsense into the shivering heap, shop talk and bad jokes, and the one lullaby his mother had sung off-key, while the rain in a different valley lectured a different roof about gravity. Hours, then, the kind that don't pass so much as lean. Rain wrote its long letter on stone. Thunder tried out new names for distance. From time to time the river found something big to break and announced it with the flat crack of moral certainty. Darren's mouth tasted like metal and promises. When exhaustion finally convinced him to close his eyes, it did not win the argument about his hands. They stayed where he had put them, cupped along heat, splayed across breath, owning just enough of the world to make dawn worth the trouble of showing up. Night narrowed to the size of the shelf. The river argued with stone below in a voice that never repeated itself, and the rain kept laying down new lines on a page already too wet to hold ink. Darren's world organized into tasks small enough for a tired body to do without asking permission. Rotate the warmest hatchling toward the albino's side, shift the bronze so its freed wing lay open to dry, work the cramp out of his own calf with the edge of a knuckle, because falling asleep now would turn care into weight. He cracked the seal on a field kit with his teeth, spat out the string, and found 2 thermal patches that hadn't drowned. He pressed one against the albino's narrow chest until the adhesive believed him, tucked the other along the ribs of the blue whose shiver had learned persistence. The plasma torch coughed, dimmed, then rallied. He fed it a strip of polymer and whispered thanks to a tool as if it had feelings to be spared. He counted without drama. 10 little pulses under the pads of his fingers, 10 chests finding the slope of a slower breath. When one of them wandered off the beat, he brought it back with a palm and a hum pitched low enough to make the wet rock under them answer. He had never sung well. He sang anyway. All the practical songs that live in shipyards and kitchens, rhythms for keeping motion honest. The green, braver now that air had stopped being a privilege, tried to harmonize and produced a squeak so offended at itself that he chuckled, which made 3 more of them lift their heads, which made the pile rearrange itself like embarrassed laundry. He eased them down, murmuring nonsense about sockets and torque and the proper respect due a stubborn bolt, because the mind loves any story that turns fear into a problem with parts. A gust found them and tried to be a hand. The wall of debris held but barely. A branch skated along the top and slapped the bronze's flank hard enough to make memory flash in its eyes. Darren caught the next strike on his forearm and let the pain ground him in the good arithmetic of now. He pulled the pack he'd dragged up from the dome closer with his foot, tore the strap off, and looped it around the worst-placed stake, hauling it tighter until the knot squealed and the wall decided to be serious. He tasted blood and river grit, and kept moving because work is what the body does when the heart is out of ideas. Between thunder, he heard another sound, metal failing somewhere upstream, a gate surrendering with the flat crack of a decision. The surge that followed should have taken them. Instead, the current shifted its mind an inch to the right, and the shelf became a pocket the river forgot to claim. He let himself breathe, just once, all the way to the bottom. The albino's whistle shortened and widened into something that belonged in a chest. He slipped 2 fingers under its jaw to feel the new cadence, and found himself pressing his own throat to match, as if teaching his body and the tiny one to share a clock. Cold tried to outvote Will. He answered by building a second heat. He unscrewed the cap of his emergency light, popped the reflector, and turned it into a poor mirror. He angled it to throw the torch's glow back at the heap, turning the little circle of warmth into something that felt like a plan. The bronze, finally convinced the wing was still attached, thumped its tail once and laid the tip across his shin with the careful ceremony of a promise. He discovered he could feel the temperature of each scale with his palms now without looking. He moved down the row, making tiny corrections, blanket here, shoulder there. A hand stayed a few heartbeats longer where panic still kept a room in the lungs. Time lost its interest in punctuality. His vision did the thing tired eyes do, narrowing and blooming in pulses like a city grid rolling brownouts, each flare of clarity revealing some new, small job. Wiping mud from the albino's nostril with his sleeve, gently working a stuck claw free from the weave of his jacket, flicking a coal bright ember off a blue's membrane so the heat didn't scar. Once he nearly followed sleep's invitation down. His head tipped, the green started to slide, and his body woke before his mind, arms tightening with a speed that belonged to someone younger and less careful. He apologized out loud to a creature that could not possibly care about words. It quieted anyway, the way leaves answer to tone when vocabulary fails. A stray panel, half a roof in search of a house, lifted on a gust and tried to make their wall remember how to break. He leaned his back into it, legs braced, and felt the push translate into the shelf beneath them, into the stone, into something old enough not to budge, just because a new weather had opinions. He held until the gust lost its nerve. The torch flickered again. He backed its base into a nest of wet cloth and scrap, steadied the flame with his hands cupped around it like a priest guarding a relic he does not believe in yet. He realized his fingers had gone bloodless and flexed them, one by one, until the ache returned. The hurt of ownership, proof that the hands were still his. He worked in silence until he heard the first different bird of the night. Not thunder, not wind, not water, but the small breathy chitter hatchlings make when the nervous system learns rest. One, then another, then a cascade, as if the heap had passed a quiet instruction down its length. The albino shifted, found his heartbeat with its ear and stopped whistling long enough to dream. He kept his count because he needed to know which of them had learned the lesson first for the folder in his head he never expected to use. 8, 9, 10. He found he was grinning like a fool in the dark at nobody, and let himself keep the expression because no one respectable was present to judge. At some point the sky grew a seam. At some point the rain settled for plain falling instead of assault. At some point his teeth stopped chattering because his body had accepted the task as permanent and allocated resources accordingly. He didn't notice those thresholds. He noticed only a change in the color of the world. A gray that was less insult and more admission, and the simple, unamazing fact that his hands were where he had left them, and every small body under them still insisted on being counted. Light arrived like a confession, first as a rumor that the black had edges, then as a gray that showed the valley what it had done to itself. The floodplain looked flayed. The nursery domes were flattened lilies, their ribs showing. The lab roofs lay in the trees as if they had tried to learn perching at speed and failed politely. Mud wrapped everything in a single, unflattering color. Sound, which had been a mob, thinned into individuals. Drip, creak, one stubborn cascade somewhere insisting on being dramatic about it. The river had shouldered past the reserve and gone to argue with the next town. In its wake, a stink of torn earth and snapped lignin and the faint metallic breath of ruined circuitry hung low over the stones. Darren did what mornings require. He sat up slowly enough not to crush anyone, peeled his jacket back from the albino, and checked the line of pink along its membrane, where the grate had tried to claim it. Clean. He palpated the bronze's wing, feeling along tendon and bone for anything that would become a delayed debt. The little brute huffed indignation and then leaned its head into his palm as if consent had always been part of the examination. He cleaned mud from each nostril he could reach with the corner of his sleeve, wiped grit from eyes with the careful stroke he'd learned from a ranger who could calm a panicked fawn by apology alone, and let each small face see him see it. It was a ritual, and rituals are how you teach tomorrow to accept today's premises. He stood. His legs forgot how to be legs for a second, and then remembered. The cold had stiffened the cuts along his shins into lines that smarted as if the night were reminding him it had gone nowhere. He rolled his shoulders once, and the shelf presented itself as a problem in pulley and leverage rather than miracle. He scouted their little platform the way a machinist inspects a jig, where the weight could go, where a foot should not, where rainwater had made a lyre of stone. He found a path that an adult would not prefer, but a child might manage, and mapped it into his hands. Below, the valley coughed up motion. For a moment he thought it was more debris, then saw the deliberate hold in the angle. A rescue skiff nosing over the drowned meadow, pilot standing to see around wreckage that had never been briefed on where to properly sit. Another followed, then three, then the big rotors of an air crane shouldering slow water into wind. The first skiff's searchlight found the knuckle and crawled up the rock like a polite question. He raised one arm shoulder high and held it until the light flared acknowledgement. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He pointed, flat-handed, practical, at the small lives, then at the shelf beside them where a skiff might wedge a nose without getting ideas. He turned, scooped the albino gently, and handed it to himself twice, hands to forearm to cradle, because even care has choreography. The little body curled, decided to rehearse being brave, and blinked at the world. Good, he told it, which he had told bolts and stubborn stoves and afraid men, and it was still true. He moved the heap in order of lungs and heat. Whistler first, then the blue with the patch, then the green with too many new ideas about water. Each transfer a brief loss, followed by the reaffirmation of contact. He discovered that his voice had kept the old count all night for a reason. 1, he said to the skiff crew, handing the albino across and making sure the medic's hands were the ones the tiny chest rested on. 2. He did not say their names. Those belonged to a different room in a different day, and could be said when warm was no longer a verb. The pilot made the bow of the skiff a platform without showing off. A medic with good wrists and eyes that did not waste motion took each hatchling into a blanket and a stethoscope and the simple mercy of dry. Darren retrieved the bronze last. It tried to look offended at being made to go after children younger than it, and then surprised itself by nuzzling his jaw before surrendering. 10, he said to the light, and the number traveled down the radio net with the speed reserved for explosions and births. The second skiff eased in. He passed the thermal patches, the rigged reflector, the torch. Heat, he said. Milk powder if you've got it. No heroics on the airway. Let them find the beat they learned. The medic nodded, which is the salute of people who work for a living. Only when the last small weight had left the shelf did the world allow Darren to understand that his body had opinions. The air crane's downdraft hammered the rock and set his jacket flapping. He stepped back on instinct, and his heel found nothing. A hand caught his elbow. Captain Seal, mud up to his waist, helmet gone, face set to calm with the skill of an officer who has learned that panic is contagious, and so is the cure. With me, Seal said, not as an order, but as a good idea offered in a room where good ideas were in short supply. They made the ledge together in 3 moves, then the skiff in 2 more. Darren sat, because someone pressed him into sitting, and the seat made a case for it. On the meadow-turned lake, the rescue flotilla fell into the steady choreography that makes chaos look like an afterthought. The air crane lifted a section of collapsed dome free of a snarled fence as if removing a hat from a guest. The second skiff delivered blankets that smelled like storage and relief. Pilots set their craft down and stood in the mud, taking orders from a man with oil under his nails because the day had declared his voice the one that matched its pitch. Darren drank half a bottle of water and handed the other half to a blue who thought it might want to learn the trick. He wiped the albino's lip, where formula had painted a white crescent, and felt his heart do the foolish, shameful thing hearts do when they are given back something they never admitted to losing. The sun climbed a degree and revealed the ruin more honestly. Beyond it, on the far ridge, a figure appeared briefly against the light. A silhouette with a crest and a cloak of metal that the valley would recognize later. But the skiff shifted and the angle cut the sight away. A medic tried to drape a foil blanket over Darren's shoulders. He let it happen because the gesture belonged to the medic as much as the warmth belonged to him. He stood when the first camera drone drifted near and took a breath that fit in his chest without complaint. He stepped down into the mud until it took his ankles and held him up by holding him down. He looked not at the lenses, but at the line of blankets where 10 small lives lay in quick, uneven rows of steam, and counted very quietly to make sure he hadn't let the night bluff him. When the city saw the footage later, it wrote new myths. In the moment, it was simpler. A human with torn sleeves and river on his skin stood in a valley that had tried to forget its own name and refused to let the story subtract anyone. The pilots, who had learned to greet victory with restrained competence, clapped anyway, brief and embarrassed, the way people do when applause is not about the performer but the room. Darren tilted his head back, found the seam of blue broadening in a sky that had remembered it had other jobs, and finally allowed his shoulders to slip an inch toward rest. The count held. The day, for all its damage, had agreed to be counted. And that was enough to start building from. The skiffs made lanes through the wreckage. The air crane lifted roofs like a patient removing hats in a church. Then the shadow that had been a rumor on the ridge resolved into intent. The royal barge came down without swagger, settling in the torn meadow as if asking permission from the mud. The ramp lowered. Armor stepped, then softened, then became a woman whose weight the ground accepted as familiar. Valoria, crowned by nothing but the way air changed its mind around her. Captain Seal straightened as if his spine had been reheated and forged true. Darren did not straighten. He had already spent every spare angle on other lives. He stood with the foil blanket sliding from one shoulder, river grease still drying pale on his forearms, and watched the Empress cross the distance without the entourage catching up to her. She did not speak at first. She knelt among the lines of bundled hatchlings and let her breath travel across them, not command but climate. A blue blinked, decided the air had gone gentle, and slept again. The albino's chest, taped with a thermal patch and goodwill, rose and fell like an argument finally persuaded. Only then did her gaze find the human who had refused subtraction. Up close, her eyes had the careful brightness of someone who has been told too many names for grief and prefers numbers for a while. "You held the night," she said, not loudly, the way mechanics talk to machines when they plan to be obeyed by asking. Darren shook his head once. The shelf held. I was the part that kept counting. The corner of her mouth did not quite become a smile, but the armor across her throat loosened a fraction, as if some old coil had finally consented to unspool. Protocol, panting, arrived late. An aide pushed forward with a case that had opinions about ceremony. Valoria didn't open it. "What do you need?" she asked, eyes still on the row of breaths that makes the next storm less greedy. Requests leapt to 100 tons nearby, funds, crews, studies, but the human answered first, because triage is a language you don't forget once learned. "High ground inside the nursery, built in and boring," he said, voice rasped thin. "Floats under the pens that don't wait for permission, heat that doesn't drown. A way for a man with 2 hands to move 10 lives without asking a door to be kind." She nodded as if the valley had made a sensible proposal. "Done," she said, and turned the single syllable into architecture. "Seal, design with him and do not improve his simplicity." She walked the ruin as one consults a ledger, taking the measure of absence. Where a broken gate leaned like a drunk against a fence post, she touched the hinge and said, "This will fail again if asked the same question." Where the river had bitten past its stone, she stood, listening, then called for engineers and maps and the kind of patience that rebuilds a valley without teaching it hubris. When a drone drifted close for its shot, she let it have her silhouette and not her face. The hour had chosen its image already, and it was a man with oil on his skin and a line of small breaths that obeyed him. Only once did she let ceremony into the day. She extended a talon, bare, unadorned, and with it lifted a stone from the knuckle's crown, slick and ordinary. "Every place has a marker," she said, weighing the river's lesson in her palm. This will be ours. She pressed the stone into Darren's bruised hand and closed his fingers around it until the heat he carried convinced it to stay. He looked down at the mud-dark circle and saw, stupidly and exactly, a bench leveled at last. "I'm not much for metals," he said. "Stones don't tarnish," she answered, and the field medic nearby, who had spent a life making do, had to look away suddenly and pretend to adjust a strap. The guard, trained to be pillars, found themselves instead of use. They hauled lines, ferried kettles, held blankets up to block wind, while the weakest drank, stomped a stubborn piece of polymer into shape around the torch so it would throw its heat further. A protocol officer murmured about incident reports and chain of command. Valoria flicked her crest by a degree, and the officer rediscovered the value of leaving spaces for the living to write in. Before she turned to go, the Empress did the thing no one expected her to remember. She counted in whispers only the hatchlings and the human could hear. Her talon brushed each forehead. Her mouth moved, 1, 2, 3. Numbers spoken like blessings, not inventory. At 10, she exhaled and stood, the relief in her bones not triumph but repair. "Hold this count," she said to Tail without looking at him, "because some orders are not for the man they are given to, but for the room that will live with their consequences." Then she turned to Darren once more. "Stay warm," she said, which is what a sovereign says when thank you would be an insult, and left the valley to behave. Day 2 did not arrive with parades. It brought mud that tried to become permanent, and the stubborn work of pulling a shape out of ruin. Engineers strung chalk lines across slopes still slick with apology, and Darren stood with them, drawing on the back of a torn tarp with a carpenter's pencil nub. A terrace inside the nursery that sat above any map the river would admit to, a spine of flotation under each pen that lifted at the mere suggestion of water, rails at shoulder height along every wall because in a night like that you need somewhere to leave a hand. He argued in favor of ugly angles that shed debris. He won. The new foundations forgot how to drown and learned how to hold. The valley marked its high water in practical places. A line scratched into the knuckles face, not where tourists would see it, but where a maintenance crew would lay a wrench and remember. The rescue crews started calling the ledge by his name only to one another, Miles's shelf, because rooms are easier to respect when they've been properly introduced. The reserve rebuilt the nursery with a quiet ridiculousness that would have made the old architects blush. Each dome with an island afloat within, each island with latches only a tired hand could operate in the dark without looking. Someone wrote the operating instruction in big plain letters over the main door. If the river argues, you don't. Word outran roads. Creches on other worlds sent questions instead of flowers. Pilots who had never seen this valley adjusted their emergency kits to include thermal patches and formula, because a rumor said the Empress would ask to see the list and would notice whether a hand could find what it needed in the dark. School children drew a human stick figure with 10 little circles around him, then learned to draw a line at the top of the page that meant remember. A law clerk with sharp penmanship and a soft center snuck a single sentence into a relief bill. The count of the living shall be the measure of success. No one struck it. When Valoria signed, she underlined that line twice, not for emphasis but for habit. There was a ceremony, but it could not help itself and turned into work. The Empress returned in plain armor and without a speech longer than a minute. She stood on the new terrace while crews tightened bolts and checked seals, and set the knuckle stone in a brass ring at the base of the warming unit so it would heat a little every winter and remind whoever leaned there that the ground had learned something. She called Darren forward and offered the case that had been impatient yesterday. He shook his head, thinking of roofs that still leaked in the nearest town, and she closed it again without offense. "Then let this place wear the medal," she said, and tapped the brass ring twice, a small sound that woke the valley into listening. Solus and Vera, the names the registry would one day write in neat columns, though today they were only 2 dragonlings with new appetite, had gained a week overnight, or so it seemed. They hatched no fire, but their bodies had remembered warmth. They followed Darren across the terrace with the cheerful tyranny of the recently saved, tripping over their own certainty and chirping at the scaffold as if it owed them an apology. He kept the habit of counting even when the need had softened into superstition, lips moving around numbers as he checked each bed, each latch, each vent. 10, and the air agreed. Toward evening, when work lost its hard edges and became something like trust, the valley gathered without being summoned. Crews drifted to the knuckle, leaning shins against rock polished by the day's comings and goings. Pilots unbuckled harnesses and remembered how to sit. Medics found their hands empty and let them stay that way for a whole 5 minutes. Vyloria stood at the edge of the terrace and did not elevate her voice. "A storm asked us who we were," she said. "We answered with a number we refused to let go of." She did not say hero, she said habit, and the word landed where it needed to. Darren felt the weight of the river stone find the exact hollow of his palm and stay there as if it had always known him. Someone's child, mud to the knees, a bandage on one elbow like a note, approached with the courage of the very young and the permission of a parent who understood what nights like these do to futures. "Is it true you kept them all?" the kid asked, voice big with the math. Darren looked past him to the line of small bodies sprawled under heat lamps that hummed as if practicing the day's lesson. "We didn't put any down," he said after a moment, "because accuracy is the respect you pay a hard thing." The child nodded solemnly, then pressed half a ration bar into Darren's hand with an air of wealth, and ran as if distribution were a game he planned to win. At last light, the river found itself again. Less swagger, more direction, and the first stars figured out where to sit in a sky scrubbed clean by trouble. 2 older dragons from the high Aerie slid low across the valley, shadows with their own weather, and took up station above the nursery without being told. The hatchlings, fed and braver, rolled into a single heap of ridiculous tails and noses, and decided the world could be trusted for the length of a nap. Vyloria tapped the brass ring once more, a private superstition revealed on purpose, and turned away only when the warmth had climbed into the stone. Darren stood with his palms on the rail, thumbs running a slow circle over the ridge of the floodstone. And for the first time since the sirens failed, he let his body say what it had been not saying. His shoulders dropped the last inch, his breath stopped arguing. He did not feel large or central. He felt employed by the ordinary miracle of a count that would hold through sleep. Behind him, someone began sweeping the new floor, because there is no victory so grand that a broom isn't welcome after it. The valley, chastened and grateful, promised nothing about future weather. But under the lamps, a habit had taken hold that storms cannot unteach. When the air thins, you look for the nearest small breath and add your own until both are steady. The night returned, familiar and no longer armed. The human touched the stone, the dragons exhaled, and the world, mud-streaked, rebuilt, stubborn, remembered how to keep what it had saved.